The story of the most famous monster in history begins not in a laboratory, but in a graveyard. Imagine a young girl, barely a teenager, sitting alone in the St. Pancras churchyard in London. She is not playing. She is reading and writing, tracing the letters of her own name on a cold, gray tombstone. The name on the grave is Mary Wollstonecraft. It is her mother's grave, and the girl sitting there is Mary Shelley. To understand how an 18-year-old girl could invent the grotesque horror of Frankenstein, we must understand that for Mary, death was not a distant concept. It was her origin story. Her mother, the famous feminist philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, died just 11 days after giving birth to her. Mary Shelley entered the world as a killer of the things she needed most. She grew up carrying the heavy, silent guilt of a child who believes their existence caused a death. Her father was William Godwin, a celebrated political philosopher. He was cold, intellectual, and distant. Mary was raised in a house filled with radical ideas, but void of warmth. She was surrounded by the intellectual giants of the time. Poets, thinkers, and revolutionaries dined at her table, but she was profoundly lonely. Her education didn't happen in a classroom. It happened in that graveyard, where she would go to be close to the mother she never knew. She learned to spell by reading the epitaphs of the dead. This Gothic childhood set the stage for a rebellion that would scandalize England. When Mary was 16, she met a man. Percy Bysshe Shelley was a poet, a radical, and a genius. He was also 21, married, and a father. To Mary, he was lightning in a bottle. He represented everything her soul craved: passion, danger, and intellect. They fell in love over the grave of her mother, professing their devotion in the cemetery, a detail so morbidly romantic it feels like fiction. In 1814, they ran away together. It was social suicide. Mary's father, the great radical who preached free love, was furious and cut her off. Society branded her a whore. Percy's pregnant wife was left behind. They fled to Europe, traveling across war-torn France, living on love and philosophy. But the reality of their life was not a fairy tale. It was a nightmare of poverty and loss. Mary was just a teenager, but she was already facing the brutal biological realities of womanhood in the 19th century. She became pregnant almost immediately. The baby was born premature. One morning, Mary woke up to find the infant dead in her bed. She was 17 years old. In her diary, she wrote a haunting entry that predicts the horror to come. Dreamt that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day. Read that again. We rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Here, in the grief of a teenage mother, lies the seed of Frankenstein. The desire to conquer death. Desperate hope that a spark of heat, a jolt of energy, could bring the dead back to life. This wasn't science fiction to her. It was a mother's deepest, darkest wish. By 1816, Mary was hardened by tragedy. She was 18, but she had lived a lifetime of loss. She was an outcast, exiled from her home, living in sin with a poet who was as unstable as he was, brilliant. They decided to spend the summer in Switzerland, renting a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva. They were joining the most famous and dangerous rock star of the era, Lord Byron. They expected a summer of boating, sunshine, and poetry. But nature had other plans. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted, spewing ash into the atmosphere that circled the globe and blocked out the sun. 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Snow fell in July. The sky was permanently gray. Relentless rain battered the villa, trapping the group inside. The atmosphere was claustrophobic, heavy with sexual tension, intellectual ego, and the copious use of laudanum liquid opium. Inside the Villa Diodati, surrounded by candlelight and storms, the stage was set for the birth of a monster. The group consisted of Mary, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, Mary's stepsister Claire, who was pregnant with Byron's child, and Byron's physician John Polidori. They were young, high on opium, and bored. They spent the nights reading German ghost stories aloud, translating tales of the undead and the accursed. The wind howled outside. The thunder shook the house. And then Lord Byron, in his dramatic fashion, issued a challenge that would change literature forever. He looked at his guests, shadows dancing on his face, and said, We will each write a ghost story. The men Percy and Byron were confident. They were the literary giants of their age. They expected to easily win this game. Mary, the quiet teenage girl in the corner, the daughter of the philosophers, felt the pressure. She wanted to write something that would speak to the mysterious fears within her. But for days, the page remained blank. She had the grief. She had the setting. She just needed the spark. And one night, in the witching hour, the spark came. The year without a summer trapped them inside the Villa Diodati like prisoners. Outside, the lightning storms over the Jura Mountains were spectacular and terrifying. Inside, the conversations turned to the darkest edges of science. This was the era of galvanism. Luigi Galvani had recently demonstrated that electricity could make the muscles of dead frogs twitch. There was a rumor, a terrifying scientific theory, that electricity was the spark of life itself. Percy Shelley and Lord Byron would sit by the fire late into the night, discussing the possibility of reanimating a corpse. Could the component parts of a creature be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth? Mary sat and listened. She didn't speak, but she absorbed every word. The image of the dead baby she had dreamed of rubbing by the fire merged with the image of the galvanic battery. It was well past midnight when she finally went to bed. The storm was still raging. She placed her head on the pillow, but she could not sleep. She entered a state she called a waking dream. It was more vivid than imagination, more terrifying than reality. In her introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, she described exactly what she saw. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. She opened her eyes in terror. The room was dark. The idea was too frightening. She tried to think of something else, but the image wouldn't leave her. The yellow eyes, the skin stretched too tight over the bones. The monster standing by the curtains, looking at his creator. She realized then that she had found her story. What terrified me will terrify others, she thought. The next morning, when the men asked, "Have you thought of a story?" Mary finally said, "Yes." She began to write. At first, it was meant to be a short story. But with Percy's encouragement, it grew. It became a novel. But it wasn't just a story about a monster destroying a village. It was a story about a bad father. Victor Frankenstein is often mistaken for the monster. But Mary makes it clear, Victor is the monster. He creates life, and then, disgusted by its ugliness, he abandons it. He runs away. The creature is left alone, confused, innocent, and desperate for love. "I ought to be thy Adam," the creature tells Victor, "but I am rather the fallen angel." This was Mary's subconscious screaming on the page. She was writing about her own father, William Godwin, who had been emotionally distant. She was writing about God, who creates humans and leaves them to suffer. And she was writing about the pain of bringing life into the world, the blood, the terror, and the responsibility. While the men at the villa wrote vampires and fragments of poems, the 18-year-old girl wrote a masterpiece that deconstructed the human soul. She finished Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, in 1817. It was published anonymously in 1818. When the public read it, they were horrified and fascinated. But when they found out the author was a woman, and a teenage girl at that, they refused to believe it. Critics argued that the book was too violent, too dark, too strong to have been written by a female hand. They assumed Percy Shelley had written it. How could a young girl know so much about the smell of death? How could she describe the anatomy of a corpse with such precision? They didn't understand that Mary had been living with ghosts her entire life. But the publication of the book was not the end of her tragedy. It was almost as if by bringing the monster to life on the page, she had unleashed a curse upon her own reality. The darkness of the book began to bleed into her actual life. The years following Frankenstein were a sequence of relentless horror. It seemed that everyone Mary loved was destined to die. First was her half-sister, Fanny Imlay. Fanny, lonely and depressed, committed suicide by taking an overdose of laudanum. She was found dead in an inn, her name removed from the suicide note to protect the family's reputation. Then came Harriet, Percy's abandoned wife. She was found floating in the Serpentine River in London's Hyde Park. She was heavily pregnant. She had drowned herself. Mary and Percy were now free to marry, but the wedding was held under a cloud of guilt and death. The Frankenstein curse was just beginning. They moved to Italy to escape the gossip, but death followed them across the Alps. Mary gave birth to a daughter, Clara. The baby died of dysentery in Venice. A year later, her beloved son, William, named after her father, died of malaria in Rome. Mary sank into a black depression. She had given birth to 4 children, and 3 of them were dead. Only one son, Percy Florence, survived. She was 22 years old, and she walked the earth like a ghost. She wrote in her journal, "Everything I love is taken from me." But the final blow was yet to come, the ultimate tragedy that would mirror the stormy waters of her book. By 1822, Mary and Percy were living in Italy, on the coast. Their relationship was strained. The grief of losing their children had created a wall of silence between them. Percy, ever the flighty spirit, was spending time with other women, seeking the intellectual beauty he constantly wrote about. Mary was left alone with her depression and her surviving son. In July 1822, Percy Shelley decided to sail his boat, the Don Juan, from Livorno to Lerici. He was warned about the weather. The skies were turning dark, the air heavy with static. It was the same kind of atmosphere that had birthed Frankenstein 6 years earlier. A sudden, violent storm swept across the bay. The boat vanished. For days, Mary waited. She paced the terrace, scanning the horizon. The waiting was agony. Finally, 10 days later, 2 bodies washed ashore. They were so decomposed that they could only be identified by their clothes. Percy Shelley was identified by a book of Keats' poetry in his pocket, doubled back as if he had been reading it when the wave hit. He was 29 years old. The cremation of Percy Shelley is one of the most grotesque and romantic scenes in literary history. Italian law required bodies that washed ashore to be burned on the beach to prevent plague. Lord Byron and their friends gathered on the sand. They built a funeral pyre. As the flames consumed the body of the poet, something strange happened. His body burned, but his heart would not. Perhaps it was a calcification caused by an earlier illness, or perhaps it was a poetic miracle. His friend Edward Trelawney reached into the flames and snatched the heart from the fire, burning his hand in the process. Mary Shelley was now a widow at 24. She returned to England with her son and a strange, macabre possession, her dead husband's heart. She spent the rest of her life as a keeper of the flame. She edited Percy's poems, ensuring his legacy would survive, turning him into the saint of the Romantics. She wrote other books, The Last Man, a terrifying post-apocalyptic novel about a plague that wipes out humanity until only one man is left. It was a reflection of her own soul. She felt like the last human on Earth. She never remarried. When asked why, she famously said, "I want to be written on my tombstone, Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein." She knew that her identity was forged in that dark creation, but she kept a secret until the day she died. When Mary Shelley passed away in 1851, at the age of 53, her family opened her desk. Inside, wrapped in a page of one of Percy's poems, they found the calcified remains of his heart. She had kept it with her for nearly 30 years. A piece of the dead kept alive by memory. Just like Victor Frankenstein trying to hold on to life, Frankenstein is often called the first science fiction novel. But that label is too cold. It is a biography of trauma. The monster is not a villain. He is an abandoned child. He is the rage of the unwanted. He is the grief of the motherless. Mary Shelley didn't just write a scary story. She looked into the mirror and saw the monsters that live inside us all. Loneliness, rejection, and the inability to control life and death. She was a teenager who walked through a cemetery and decided to challenge God. She lost the battle, everyone she loved died, but she won the war of immortality. Her monster is still alive today. It walks through our movies, our nightmares, and our culture. In the end, Victor Frankenstein died, chasing his creation across the ice. But Mary Shelley stopped chasing. She embraced her ghosts. She understood what her monster knew all along, that the only thing more terrifying than death is being truly, utterly alone.